Conversations with Grandfather, Decoding Grandfather's Fourth Prophecy, Volume Number 4. All right, what I'm going to do with this is part of me says that, there is a part of this fourth prophecy, and with me, as I've been mulling this over and going through notes and everything else of what I want to say and expand upon, this, like none other, is one where I've got to say to myself, now what do I cut out? Because this thing is huge. All the hidden meanings. Plus, in this fourth prophecy, this is the one that I edited the most before it went into the book. All of them I edited, of course. There's sections that I haven't even covered, whether in written form in this book or even what I went through with you folks in other recording sessions and conversations with Grandfather that I haven't even touched yet. But I was thinking to myself the other day that just that second prophecy, I could have gone a week worth of recording. Because, you see, granted, there is that night of the prophecy where he divulged, he passed on to Rick and I the four major prophecies of man's destruction, the destruction of life on this planet as we know it. But you see, that didn't stop there. Because as I began to reflect on what he said, as I took it to my sacred areas at sunrise and sunset for the next several months, and I should say the next several years, because it never truly ended, that I would start to get greater insights, which I would question Grandfather about. And then he'd give me one of his very concise one-liners, or sometimes go off like an explosion. In other words, he would just download all of this information because he realized that I had come to a point of understanding. The interesting thing was that when I was recording the third prophecy, a couple of things came to me that kind of took me by surprise in a way, because I did not intend to say them, but they just came out. They just kind of, and I had to go with it, which with the last class I did, the kind of like the Way of the Shaman reunion, I very much addressed an issue that I had brought up in last recording session. And let me clarify this, and I can't go too far with it because virtually it took me that whole reunion weekend to even come moderately close to spelling it out. But anyway, I had made a statement last recording that the most lethal predator on earth is a man with nothing to lose. Now, I caught myself in saying that because I suddenly began to mesh that with the spirit that moves through all things. And here's the interesting thing, is that when I use the context of man being the most deadly predator on earth, and especially one with nothing to lose, I was not speaking of an individual. I was speaking rather of a concept. You know, and I have, and grandfather also, have spelled this out for years, but most people miss it. When you think of the spirit that moves through all things, also known as the force, what I have recently begun to add to this whole concept of the spirit that moves through all things is this. I have taught people that an inroad to the spirit that moves through all things is something called the keepers of the force, or the keepers of the spirit that moves through all things. Now, if you'll notice in my philosophy workshops, it's like I do with the void. I address the spirit that moves through all things, the force. We do a couple of small exercises with it, and then it's kind of brushed aside. And then we find ourselves, or I purposely take you into the realms of spirit. The reason that I tend to sidestep the spirit that moves through all things is that power is so immense, so abstract, so convoluted, that it is beyond our comprehension. Now, when grandfather explained to me what we call the keepers of the force, I was surprised at the explanation that he gave me. Of all things, grandfather, the most low-tech teacher on earth, brought in something very familiar to Rick and I. The radio. As I tell people, I never saw a television set until I was 18. It wasn't part of our lives. And even when I saw it, I said, yeah, okay, that's cool. And went about playing in the woods, But we knew radio. We knew radio because that, growing up where I grew up, that was pretty much, family entertainment kind of a thing, which I never got into, because television was just coming around them, radio was dying off. But I'd hear my mom playing it or my dad listening to something on the radio, and I would watch him going through the radio dial to tune in exactly what he wanted. So Rick and I were familiar with it. And grandfather said to us, imagine if you took every radio wave out there, and you could hear it, and all of a sudden everything that was on the radio throughout the world was suddenly playing, talking, doing whatever in front of you. He said, could you understand it? And we said, of course, no. Because one thing would step on another, would wash over another, given the factor of static and everything else. It would be beyond our comprehension. But then he said, what if I handed you a radio? A radio that you now have the ability of turn up and down the volume, but get exactly the radio station that you want to listen to. He said to us that radio is very similar to a keeper of the force. And I look back on that explanation, I think to myself, my God, with his explanation of a world full of radio waves, for regular AM, FM radio that we could never comprehend if it was all playing at once, hardly even comes close to scratching the surface of the power of the force, the spirit that moves through all things. Hardly comes close. Even today, adding all the new radio waves and waves that we have out there television, SATCOM, global positioning systems, shortwave radio, regular radio, cell phones, wireless internet. And God knows how much more that's out there. That still doesn't scratch the surface of the power of the force, the spirit that moves through all things. Think about it. That spirit that moves through all things, that force, is made up of everything in our physical world. You, me, every animal, every plant, every rock, every cloud, every star that we can see and beyond. But so too, part of that is every bustling city, every automobile, every factory spewing death is also contained in that spirit that moves through all things. It's as if, going back to the original radio analogy, that every human on the planet had their own radio station, along with every rock, every grain of sand, every tree. That's how enormous it is. So he said that these keepers of the force are a way that we can tap into, hear, and fully understand that element of the force that we need to contact, that we need to use, that our mission, our purpose drives us to understand. And what it does is muffle out the rest, take it all away. Doesn't have it disappear, but it hushes it. As a child, and as I've said, I used to think, okay, a keeper of the force is a little bit of tree, a little bit of deer, add some mouse hair, 2 stones, and a wildflower, shake it up, and you have, boom, a keeper of the force. But in short order, I realized that it's more than that. It's a harmonic, a term that I use frequently. A harmonic is when you take 2 notes, 2 distinct notes, played in a certain way, they create a third, very distinct note that is independent of the other 2. In other words, that note is something bigger. Well, there are so many keepers out there. Keepers of the flame, keepers of the track, keepers of the game. As I said to people, you know, when you deal with the concept of keeper, you look at the Lenape people in the Pine Barrens, in the Delaware region, and they had a keeper of the game or a keeper of the forest. To listen to the description of this entity is quite amazing. Man-like, huge, hairy, gorilla-like, even though they didn't have the term gorilla. And when you start seeing their carvings and pictographs, you say, my God, that's Bigfoot. That's Sasquatch. That's the Yeti. Duh. Keepers of the forest. For instance, in that frame of mind, why the coyote was so sacred to grandfather's people was that the coyote is considered the keeper of the ancient knowledge. The keeper of the ancient knowledge, and that meant both physical and spiritual knowledge. That's why grandfather was so proud to say, I belong to the coyote clan. Anyway, when I accidentally, and I don't believe in accident. I don't believe in coincidence. Somehow, without me really thinking about it, in the last time I did the recording, I let this slip out. But just so far before I reined it in and said, whoa, I can't go there. Basically, when I said a man with nothing to lose, a person, I was referring to the Spirit that moves through all things. Notice I or grandfather never call it the spirits, plural, that move through all things. It is the Spirit. And I'll tell you right now, as my last Way of the Shaman reunion found out, that it is not a composite. It is not a harmonic. It is an entity with its own identity. I remember, and as I made the last class aware, the Way of the Shaman reunion, which is a class of veterans, people that go back 20, 25 years with me, stunned when I said this, that it wasn't a composite, that it had its own identity. And I related a story to them. I said to you, notice that you will rarely see a quote from me from grandfather that goes on after 1962 or 1963. I think once or twice I've used a quote from him that hit on 64. But that was more skill-oriented. You got to figure that by the time I was 12, 13 years old, grandfather was getting into some really heavy-duty teaching spiritually. And consider the amount of dirt time that he demanded of me as an unspoken rule. Countless times in vision quests. 1 day, 4 days, 10 days, every morning, every evening at sunset, wrestling, defining these spiritual concepts. And I had been going through the keepers of the force. And I started to say, oh my God, okay, I'm going to build a fire. I can consult the keeper of the flame. I could consult the keeper of the coal. I could consult the keeper of the hand drill. And then I realized, well, of course I could put these together. And then one magical evening, something happened. I was dealing in a big way with the keepers of the force in general, actually, meaning the Spirit that moves through all things. And this thing hit me like a ton of rocks. It hit me so much, it brought tears to my eyes. It made me tremble. And I remember it was just reaching dark. And I come up to grandfather's camp shaken, probably gray. And I was about to say something about the Spirit that moves through all things. And he smiles at that wry grin and toothy grin of his, and he said, "So, you felt it." And I said to myself, why, you old bastard. I couldn't even go further in the conversation. I walked away. That was my first glimmer into realizing that the Spirit that moves through all things is not a composite, is not a harmonic. It is an entity with its own identity. 6 months later, he said, "So, you've heard it." And then there came that day that I finally saw it. And it shocked me. It stunned me. It held me spellbound in awe, frightened beyond belief. Oh no, I'm not talking that this spirit that moves through all things is God, the Creator, the unseen and eternal, the great mystery. No. It's a major part of it, though. It's a major part of it. That is what I'm talking about when I said the most dangerous creature on earth is a man with nothing to lose. So what I'm talking about is the Spirit that moves through all things. When it reaches that point of those burning red skies, it no longer has anything to lose. It is going to do whatever it takes to purge itself of the cancer, of the infection that has slowly and effectively been killing it. What happens to a human or an animal when they get sick? Violent fever, trembling, shaking, vomiting, every orifice of the body out of control. As that body, in its final act of trying to preserve itself, is going to do whatever it takes. That's what I talked about. That's what I meant. That's what I was afraid to expand upon because, my God, I just scratched the tip of the iceberg. That way of the shaman reunion went just a tiny bit deeper. So, I didn't intend to go here, but I think I will. Just to be like grandfather and give you tormented seeds for thought for the rest of your lives. If it stands to reason that the Spirit that moves through all things is made up of everything in our physical world, coming together to form, yes, something immense, something huge that we can get to as first like learning a foreign language or learning a language of our birth like children. And then suddenly it all comes together to form an entity, a being with its own identity that is beyond the concept of harmonics or composites. You know, I had trouble with that. I said, Grandpa, I don't understand that. He said, grandson, the answer lies within your own body. Took me a while, which it always did, to realize what he was saying. He said, your body, well, he didn't say this, but I realized what he was talking about is your body is composed of cells. Each cell very similar, the billions of them, to every person, grain of sand, boulder, car, city on the earth. Keepers then must be like your heart, your lungs, your liver. But there is a point where suddenly we step back from that, and there it is, the human. With its own mind, its own personality, its own unique identity. I liken it to this. Imagine the tiniest wood mite living on a cluster of leaves in a giant redwood in California. Everything in that mite's world comes from that cluster of leaves. It is incomprehensible to that mite that it is living on a living entity, the redwood or sequoia, because it's too immense. That's like us on the earth. So, okay, we have this spirit that moves through all things. Does it not stand to reason then that the same thing must happen in the spirit world? That every spirit there, everything that's found in the spirit world comes together in one consciousness, which grandfather called the spirit that moves through all spirit. Following the same rules as the spirit that moves through all things, there then must be keepers of the spirit. And following that same philosophy, the spirit that moves through all spirit must have its own identity beyond the harmonic, beyond the collage of parts. So we have the spirit that moves through all spirit. We have the spirit that moves through all things. And we have the Creator. Oh man, a trilogy. Where have we heard that before? Well, you spin the dial. So many religions and sects of religions have a trilogy of some sort. Referred to and sometimes unreferred to, except in lengthy, dusty text. So that's the one that frightens me. That spirit that moves through all things with nothing to lose. And you know the domino effect, because the spirit that moves through all spirit is also going to have nothing to lose. You want to talk about potential for Armageddon and that biblical proportion disaster. Holy mackerel, there's nothing like is going to happen when the earth purges itself. I want to be far away from those cancer growths. I want to be far away from that disease. You see, in a way, and I can't fully explain this, it gets to a point where the children of the earth have got to run to the wild places and hide themselves. So atypical of a warrior. Like I tell classes, I'm like grandfather. I'm a warrior. I fight from the front lines, not from the rear. Retreat is not part of my vocabulary. Neither is surrender when it comes to this war. But running to the wild places, is that not surrendering? giving in to the inevitable, going against the scout warrior tradition of fighting to the death if needs be to save our people and the earth? No, it doesn't. It just simply means another more powerful warrior takes over. And that warrior I speak of is the Spirit that moves through all things. There are times in the battle when a warrior has got to take a break, where reinforcements come in, because they realize if they go too far, that they'll be no good. They'll be useless. They'll be too battered and beaten up. So don't look at it in that exodus of the children of the earth running to the wild places and hiding themselves as a defeat. Look at it instead as reinforcements in the form of one entity, the Spirit that moves through all things. And you get something that powerful, that potentially lethal. You don't want to be anywhere near it when it goes to battle, because you'll end up as the one of the unnumbered collateral damage deaths. It's like in Vietnam, before they'd wipe out some place with napalm, they would call out the patrols. Get out of there. You got a window of time of 40 minutes before it's wiped off the face of the planet. That's why we have to run. I'm too old to run. Trying to design that wheelchair, you know. Now I ask myself, why in God's name did I ever bring that up? But anyway, I wanted to clarify that from the last time I sat down and went through that third prophecy and made that statement, because some people did look dumbfounded. And I had to just give enough without going too far overboard. And this has been haunting me since I said it. And now I have to say it. I have to preserve it. After all, these conversations with grandfathers, tapings, are not by accident. They're part of the preservation series. Stuff I want to pass down. Stuff that I, rather grandfather, wanted preserved. So I can say, grandfather, I fulfilled my promise. And yeah, I know I had to take that responsibility that some of the things I'm going to say, not just today, not just tomorrow, but in the other tapings that I have planned through the next whatever, that you're going to walk away with stuff in your minds and your hearts that are going to haunt you for the rest of your life. You're going to wrestle with them, just as I did growing up. Because grandfather was not so free with information. As I said, he was a master of one-liners. And in those one line lie an eternity of work. So this now brings us to the threshold of the fourth and final prophecy. But I cannot really say that in good conscience, because actually there is more. You know, I had said that there is between the third and the fourth prophecy, there are 4 days where grandfather sat and waited. And I covered it and I said that nothing spoke to him. Nothing communicated to him. And that was not entirely true. One thing did speak to grandfather, and it was called the Spirit that moves through all things. The actual Spirit itself. And gave grandfather 3 other prophecies. So basically, if you look at them cold and realistically, there are 7 prophecies. Those 3, however, are supporting prophecies, clarifying, and where they lie between the 3rd and the 4th, clarifying so much. Those I'll deal with a little bit later, but then there is this prophecy that I call hope. And it comes at the very end. All right. You know, as I began the thought or visionary process of realizing that I wanted to start to preserve a lot of teachings of grandfather that will never go into the mainstream tracker classes, that will not show up in any intensive class. I knew that the first series would have to be with grandfather's prophecies. And I've got a pretty clear idea of where I will move once what we call the prophecy preservation series is both expanded and over with. My intent is to go into the chapter and the huge expansion called Grandfather Explains Vision. I mean, I was just looking through that not long ago. And I thought to myself, I was reading these certain lines, which I don't normally read in class. It was 2 sentences. And I said to myself, my God, what that contains is beyond comprehension. And I'm just asking Carl, how long do these tapes go and stuff like that? Because, you know, as a survivalist, you try to do a number of things at once. So I'm thinking, you know, ahead and this and that and the other thing. And I'm thinking just those 2 lines are going to take 2 sessions, you know. Back to my original thought is I started to contemplate this whole process. And as this process began and of course continued, as I went through the various prophecies, I find that more and more and more things dealing with those prophecies are coming to light. And it's not as if I'm asking for them in a way. It's just they happen to show up, and some of them from absolute left field. For instance, as I said, when grandfather delivered these prophecies, you got to remember, I met grandfather when I was 7 years old. He was 83. And he dated the 3rd prophecy. When those skies will turn red. I met him in April of 1957. I was 7 years old. Could tell you the exact day, but I'll leave you guessing. He said to me that when I reach his age, remember he was 83 at the time, his age when we talked to stones together, that was the day we met. Remember, the fossils are talking stones in his mind, in his heart. That's what he called fossils. The skies would turn red. So if you calculate when I'm going to be 83, his age, that is 2033. 2033. Now, I keep hearing this damn date. And the confirmation comes from so many different sources. For instance, one I stated recently is there was this huge conference being held dealing with the issue of global warming. And of course, anything dealing with that really interests me because global warming is the big one, along with diseases. And for the first time, at the end of that article, and I can't remember now if it was in the Times or USA Today or whatever, I have them back at my house, and I want to put them together. In fact, I'm thinking by the next session of this, I'm going to get them duplicated and like we did that one class, and pass them out. The first time in any article they talk about this domino effect of what global warming is going to do. And we always hear the upheaval of climate, the storms, the places that were once forest are going to turn to desert, the deluges, the hurricanes, and everything else. But now, for the first time in this article, they mention disease. And you remember what I said about disease. This is a common thread that runs through the entire fabric of grandfather's prophecies. It is that disease that scares the hell out of me. The unseen enemy that is right now on our doorstep. And for the first time, this article compares the global warming issue to a petri dish and said we are going to see the emerging of new diseases because of that climate change. And we're going to see diseases that we once thought we eradicated come back in a more lethal form because of that global climatic change. One recent article, which was unrelated to this article, but as part of the global warming series, and I'm searching desperately to see what I did with the damn article. It was both in an article and I think in the JAMA publication, the Journal American Medical Association. They said they expect malaria to come back to the southern states within the next 5 to 10 years, but in a more lethal and viral form. Malaria. So much for retirement in Florida. You know, I mean, seriously. And a lot of these, this malaria is like tuberculosis now, and like staph infection now, is resistant to our best antibiotics and medications. So, for the first time, I hear that, whoa, this global warming comparing the earth to a new gigantic petri dish. given optimum growing conditions to any lethal pathogen out there. You want to grow up a bug like Sporobolomyces salmonum color. You take a petri dish, you get nutrient agar, you take a smear of that and put it in there, and then what do? You stick it in an incubator. And within a day, the thing has been overtaken by that bug. And that's what's happening. But the second thing, and the thing besides disease, besides that thing that it's scaring the hell out of me, is that reoccurrent date that keeps coming up from the most bizarre sources. Sources outside the spiritual, if you will. For instance, that same article, a second article with that series on global warming and the collection of scientists from all over the world, they were addressing the rainforest, which incidentally, I just heard this. I just did a talk yesterday on NPR, National Public Radio. It was tracking oriented, but I was kind of, when I was waiting to get on to be interviewed, they had this thing about the rainforest. Last year, 1,000 square miles fell, was turned into slash and burn pasture land, which doesn't last but a few years, and soy production, as in soybeans. Frightening. 1,000 square miles. Wow. Just last year. And they said this article referring to the rainforest and this slash and burn, that it is going to slowly and very effectively not only affect the oxygen level, the atmosphere, and this laundry list of other things, but they said at the rate that the trees are falling just in the Amazon now, I'm not talking about any other rainforest in the world, just in the Amazonian rainforest, they said if it continues to fall at the rate it's been falling, that by 2030, that we will have tipped the balance with no chance of recovery whatsoever. In other words, we will have gone too far. 2030. Wow. Scientific findings, calculations affecting every little thing in the world, this falling of the rainforests. And then, Brother Phil, of all people, just kidding, Phil, more tracker classes under his belt than any other living human individual other than me. How many now? 80. But give or take a few dozen. During the Way of the Shaman reunion, he says, Tom, I just read this article where a mathematician, I'll leave this up here, this is one of the things I'm going to copy for the next session. That won't be tomorrow, but depends. If Debbie can get. I think it's interesting. This mathematician back in 1999 estimated a number of factors, the rate of growth of population and this and that and the other thing, and comes up with a date of the total collapse of civilization as we know it as 2030. Go figure. Go figure. And I keep hearing these things coming in. And, every once in a while, Mama Nature throws humankind a curve, and brings us to our knees. And I keep saying, when are people going to realize that we're living above and beyond the carrying capacity of the land? When are we going to realize that we have badly damaged our planet, stolen life from our children and grandchildren? Most of all, when are we going to realize that we are not gods? We must obey the same laws that the animals do, the same laws of nature, or we will perish. Like the deer in winter that exceed the carrying capacity of the land, the mass starvation that goes there is going to happen here. So every once in a while, Mama throws us something. Like a huge, debilitating snowstorm. I remember back in the early 90s that this island, when you drove down the boulevard, and consider my vehicle was the only one on the boulevard because I was towing the rest of the sorry butts out, it was like this tunnel that you'd see in the mountains of the Sierras. I don't know how many feet of snow it snowed. People without electricity, without power. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, now they'll realize. Or some little gal named Katrina that spanked the hell out of the South. And I think, oh man, now people are going to realize that, we're not above nature. We build these buildings, we have these awesome vehicles, in Florida they build houses that they say are hurricane proof and all the rest of it, all in our lusty attempt to try to rise above those laws of creation. And we get spanked. And I think of then, my thoughts go, wow. High-tech wars, smart bombs, laser sights on rifles, this, that, and the other thing. And it was funny because there was this one guy I knew, I'd known for years. I knew him and trained him through his entire Navy SEAL career, 6 tours of duty in Vietnam. The guy had a body like a Greek god. The guy had that kind of attitude where I don't care how cold it gets, I'm still going. And I remember once after he retired, he's still hitting the weight pile, and he's refusing to give in to getting a little gray and stuff like that. And I go to visit him and ended up getting into his living room, and there he is, this big hulking 250-pound mass with a 32-inch waist of ripped steel, laying in a lazy boy recliner, wrapped in a heavy blanket with a thermometer in his mouth, and weak as hell. That's why the bugs scare me. Bugs not in insects, though they will be the vectors, but disease. I don't care how big and strong a person is. That is a law of creation. You can have the strongest armies in the world. One bug, one disease, and it'll wipe it out. I think it was Napoleon that said an army travels on its stomach. That's true. That's true. But I might add that an army also travels on its health. You know, more Native Americans, especially here in the Northeast, died of disease than they did of being murdered by muskets. It was common practice when an early pioneer and settler would be infected with a bug like smallpox, that they would take that clothing of the deceased and give it over to the Native American people, which subsequently wiped out entire villages. That's why disease scares me so much. That is a law of nature. You will get sick at one point or another. People think if the end comes, that person with the strongest army is going to be the dominant people in the world. But that army will succumb to a law of creation. You will get sick. And given these new super bugs, viruses, bacteria that are being created in this petri dish of global warming, our enemy is the most lethal form on earth. No terrorists blowing themselves up in vehicles or flying planes into buildings can come close to the destructive capabilities of disease. And like I said for probably 2 recordings now, that what scares me is you have an individual that has no qualms about strapping C4 around their belt and driving into a populated market that has women and children and blowing themselves up. What keeps that same person from going into the Congo or other places in Africa, picking up a disease called Ebola, and before it shows and rears its ugly head in that person, they go onto an airplane bound for JFK, Liberty, LA airport, cough all over everybody in that plane. The consequences are unimaginable. Especially, my brother blessed me with showing me video pictures of people dying of Ebola, where they're vomiting out in the most bloody form every organ in their body. And just one simple molecule of spittle in a cough that happens to fall on an epithelial membrane of your body, and you've got the bug. And that thing is so fast mutating that our cures are very hard to keep up with it. That's frightening. That's frightening. And of course, to rehash that point, that's why grandfather said, and the spirits told him, that the children of the earth must run to the wild places and never return, because diseases will remain. As easily as they remain in the interior of 4,000-year-old pyramids, they will remain in the cities of man. It's one thing to face another person in battle. It's quite another to face something you cannot see in that same battle, where all the high-tech weapons of the world, including those found in syringes and pill form, will not make a difference in your demise. Did I get off on a tangent? Yeah, I guess I did. Good. Anyway, sorry for rehashing that, but these things keep coming up, keep cropping up. And I don't have to look very far for them. They're all over the place. After a while, I just stopped reading the newspaper. I reluctantly look at any news show on television because of what's going on. I don't want to hear anymore. I used to do that because I want to know what's going on in the world. I want to know where the epidemics are. I want to know where the starvation is. I want to know where the genocide is. I want to know the new diseases, but I've had enough. I'm tired of it. Too late. You find yourself looking toward the sky more so than looking toward the printed page or the flickering screen of a television set. Now we embark on the fourth prophecy. The final prophecy, the final big one anyway. Anything else is what we would consider support. Support of the other three prophecies, or collectively the four prophecies. Incidentally, it does and it doesn't pertain to prophecy. But grandfather once told me that, and this was a prophecy, that his people, meaning the Lipan Apache, would be scattered, would no longer be a tribe and collection of clans. But he said that someday they will come back together again. And he says to me that I'll know when this happens, because a Lipan man, an elder, with his young eyes, will come to me for teaching. And lo and behold, last standard of the summer, along came one who is a Lipan Apache, who is also on the council of the Lipan people, the Lipan tribe. What's interesting is grandfather was right. The Lipans are not recognized technically by the United States government as an independent tribe. You see, in their heyday, the estimates of the Lipan tribe were between 250 and 400 or 500 people, 400 or 500 individuals. That's not a lot of people that make up a tribe. Plus, with the Lipans, their numbers were scattered. They were highly mobile, highly scattered, migratory people. So when reservation period came around, the Lipans either, number one, escaped into Mexico, as did grandfather's clan, or the remnants of grandfather's clan, or were absorbed into reservations. Some actually went to Florida, to the reservations there. Some out to the White Mountain area. Slowly they began to lose their bloodline, but now there is a resurgence in the Lipan people trying to reclaim their identity and their tribe, as well as their clans. So, grandfather told me that I would be instrumental in all of that. That the circle would be completed. And I remember I was honored to be invited down to the Lipan family reunion gathering. You got to remember, this is newly formed tribe now, coming back together. And the people were absolutely stunning, exquisite. They all had this single-minded focus of getting that tribe back together. They don't want lands. They don't want any assistance from the government. They don't want to build casinos. They just want their family back, which to me was a breath of fresh air. And what was nice is that I was so openly welcome. And to me, one of the most delightful things as I sat there kind of just stepping back from all of this is to watch one of my former students teaching children of the Lipan, and to hear their laughter, to watch them get uplifted by these skills, to watch them go running to their parents and showing them how to make cordage or a basket weave or something. I could feel that circle's completion. Unfortunately, it's part of the prophecy that says we're moving dangerously close to the red skies. And it didn't, certainly it's the beginning. And Juan came back just recently to Florida with his brother, and his brother just was amazed at the skills of grandfather, actually his birthright. But anyway, continuing now into this fourth, and I hate to say final prophecy, but it is. Just give me a minute here. I just want to see where I want to pick this up. As many of you veterans know, I read and then I go back to expand what grandfather meant. In fact, an example of this was in the last prophecy, where the warrior spirit was back from grandfather and talking to him. Eventually moving very close, intimately, and talking to him in the whisper. That depicts the closeness of the third sign, meaning the red skies. Let me start with this paragraph, but I kind of elaborated on it. I did elaborate on it greatly in the last recording session. But it's a nice lead-in. And I state, grandfather sat in shocked horror as the voice continued. From this time when the stars bleed to the fourth and final sign, there will be 4 seasons of peace. Now, as I said, we cannot look at these 4 seasons in the context of spring, summer, winter, fall. because that was not the overall context that the Spirit was using. We have to look at that as the 4 seasons of a person's life. And I said, you must be careful with that. And as I said, you've all heard the expression, I'm in the autumn of my years. And we hear that referring to age, and this is the way this was meant to be delivered. But then I said, be careful, because I forgot, life expectancy today is somewhere, 75, 80 years old. But what is life expectancy going to be when those skies turn red? You go back to 1810 or 1750. You were considered an old man at 40 years old. You know what I mean? Middle-aged at virtually 20. Because of the hard life and the diseases and God knows what else you faced. So life expectancy is subject to interpretation, leaving us to say, what's the expectancy of life then, these 4 seasons? And my warning was, get out. Go. Don't hesitate. Don't think, I'll put it off to the last moment, because then it'll be too late. Lord knows what diseases that you will contact in that period of hesitation. It is in these 4 seasons that the children of the earth must live deep in the wild places and find a new home close to the earth and to the Creator. It is only the children of the earth that will survive, and they must live the philosophy of the earth, never returning to the thinking of man. And as I said, it's not just mankind, humankind's thinking. It is where they live. Never returning. And survival will not be enough, continuing the quote. For the children of the earth must also live close to spirit. So tell them not to hesitate. If and when this 3rd sign becomes manifest in the stars, for there are but 4 seasons to escape. Grandfather said that the voice in the red sky lingered for a week and then were gone as quickly as they were manifest. That tells you that those skies will remain red. It isn't going to be a fleeting little thing. You're watching sunset and wow, the entire sky turns red for a few minutes and then disappears. No, this is going to leave no doubt in your mind that day and night, those skies are red. You don't get a better warning than that. It was neat because there was this Hopi man that was a guest at this Lippin reunion. And one of his prophecies, and the prophecies of course, a couple of the elders, were of 2 comets that were supposed to hit the earth. Now, I'm not talking about the devastating comets that, wiped out supposedly the dinosaurs, but comets nonetheless, which could have the capability of turning the skies red day and night for a week. Who knows? But interesting that these occur in that same time frame. Grandfather did not remember how many days he'd spent at the mouth of the cave, nor did it make a difference, for he had received the vision he had come for. Now, this is interesting because when I begin this whole scenario of the eternal cave, it starts out with grandfather sitting at the entrance, waiting for the rising sun, having just completed his third vision quest there. Now, as I said, grandfather had many, many vision quests, but the eternal cave was always the place to have vision of the probable and possible futures. And at this point, in his mind, that vision quest was complete. Yet, it began when the sun rose. He didn't realize there was more. Yet here, as it gets to the last prophecy, it says, grandfather did not remember how many days he'd spent at the mouth of the cave, nor did it make a difference, for he had received the vision he had come for. Yet in the beginning it said the vision was complete. So something occurred. Something shifted in his way of thinking or enlightenment during the delivering of these four prophecies. And where you're going to see this, where you're going to hear this, is in that period of time between the second and third prophecy, where he sat for 4 days and supposedly nothing communicated with him. Because that's when everything changed in his mind. That's where he realized, and I will get back to this tomorrow, that what he thought was the completion of his third vision quest was nothing more than a journey to that third vision quest. Preparation. He mistook preparation for the vision quest. It was in his final night at the eternal cave that the fourth vision came to grandfather. This time carried by the voice of a young child. I love that concept, that hope. Up until this point, it's always been the warrior spirit. Now it's the young child. That speaks of rebirth. That speaks of hope. That speaks of learning. That speaks of a different way, a new generation, a new vision, a new way of thinking. And it comes on the voice of a child. It comes on the voice of the innocent. That always brings me back to that concept of fleeing to the wild places, the wilderness, never returning. And I keep thinking back, especially when we bring this child into the philosophy and all of the potential of that child and all of the wonder that that child possesses and all of that newness, that freshness. And I think of when I visited the elders in Tanzania, or the elders of the Bushmen of South Africa, or the elders so desperately trying to cling to their lifestyle in the outback of Australia, or the elders in South America still living invisibly in the jungles. The lament of the elders was that they're losing young people to the cities and towns. That lure of the fabricated, that lie of the better lifestyle. knowing that when that young adult leaves, that they're going to have a life of torment. And I'm so afraid of that child's voice in the fourth prophecy. And I pray, do not be lured back to that thinking, that filth, that fabricated life. The child spoke, saying, the fourth and final sign will appear through the next 10 winters, following the night that the stars will bleed. You got to be careful with that, because this is one of these areas that I have wrestled with. Truly, when that child says, through the next 10 winters, winters is how Native Americans name their year. The Sioux's famous Winter of 100 Slain. That marks their winter. That marks their date. That's how Grandfather Rick and I, grandfather's people, marked their year. We had names for the entire year, just like we had names for the month. Certainly, the month of January is considered the month of purification. But I have Januaries that, though they're called that, have a qualifier. For instance, the moon of purification, the moon of the waist-deep snow. And I remember that year. I remember that January as if it was relived right now. So you got to say, okay, here we have this chunk of undetermined time, these 4 seasons. Does that 10 years take place after those 4 seasons? Whether they be the clinical 4 seasons of a year or the 4 seasons of a human life. Life expectancy then. Does it include that, or does it start at the end of that? You know, and I wrestled with it and wrestled with it and wrestled with it. And I remember last couple of weeks, grandfather and I were together after years of playing with that 4 seasons and 10 years. I couldn't take anymore. I went to grandfather and I said, Grandfather, what does this mean? Is this the 4 seasons of a human life expectancy? Or is this 4 seasons, and where do you start the count of 10? And he looked at me and he said to me, why do you not only disbelieve, grandson, but why do you disobey? And that's one of those ones where he reached into my chest and pulled out my throbbing heart and stepped on it. Because you know what he was saying? First of all, I needed an explanation. I needed an explanation. Secondly, my disobedience, it is then that the children of the earth must run to the wild places. Immediately. So tell them, and I quote, do not hesitate. If you are obedient, what difference does a time make? To satisfy your own idle, selfish curiosity, so maybe you could hang on for 5 more minutes to be infected by some disease that you'll carry back to the small group of people that you're migrating with and kill them all? Oh, I finally figured it out. It's a test of obedience. It's a test of faith. Chalk it up under the file of who cares. Life is over as we know it on this planet. Get out. Time no longer exists. The big secret in that, those 4 seasons, those 10 years, is that time no longer matters. Time is a myth invented by people to mark their position in space relatively to each other. But now, time no longer exists in the context in which humankind knows it. Time, for those who are fleeing, becomes eternity. And time is only measured once again by the seasons, by our internal clocks ticking from now to now to now to now, like an eternal metronome of no beginning and no ending. That's what that meant. And I keep thinking back and saying to myself, damn it, all those wasted years, all those searching vision quests of pounding my feet, going without water for days, without food, feeling the searing hot July sun tearing holes in my flesh, or freezing practically to death to find the answer to 4 seasons, 10 years, only to have my heart ripped out and said, so, why do you not believe? Why do you not obey? Why anymore at this point does time have any significance? Because time ceases to exist in the context of white man. It no longer exists. It's eternity. From now to now to now, while those who perish, they watch the clock moving them closer to death. No future, no past. Their nows, pain, anguish, starvation, fever, murder, genocide, rape. They can have their time. So, I saved you the pain, the suffering, the soul-searching ridicule of going to grandfather and asking him that same question. So, treat me as a sacrificial lamb of wasted time. During this time, the earth will heal itself and man will die. Not only the human species of mankind, but along with it, the thinking of man, the arrogance of man, the hedonistic lifestyle of man will die. That's simple. That's simple. For those 10 years, the children of the earth must remain hidden in the wild places, make no permanent camps, and wander to avoid contact with the last remaining forces of man. So why must they remain hidden for those 10 years? They don't want to end up on a rotisserie. It's that simple. You see, after that 10 years of purging, there's no longer fear. There will be no longer a need to live like the ancient scouts. There'll be no longer a need to hide. It's a very dangerous time. Because when the last of the disease has perished, there is that lure to go back and to see, to feed our curiosity. It's a very dangerous time. Continuing, they must remain hidden like the ancient scouts and fight the urge to go back to the destruction of man. Curiosity could kill many. I want to differentiate this again. Ancient scouts. There's a lot held in that word, ancient scouts. There's an old saying, a warrior is judged by the strength of his enemies. I might add, and quote grandfather, a warrior is trained by the strength of his enemies. That's more realistic. You see, before the whites came to this country, the Apache scout was the epitome of stealth, of cunning, of invisibility. Tracking was epic. Camouflage, invisibility skill bordered on the miraculous. Survival, invisible. Why? Because scouts were scouting other tribes. People that were highly aware, finely tuned to the environment. They were scouting other scouts. That's why I tell people when I practice my scout skills, my enemy is grandfather. The camp that I'm stalking is grandfather's camp. You know, when I run a scout class, I make a joke that you folks could go out and scout that party over at Apache Pass, that drunken brawl on a pogo stick with jingle bells hanging off your butt, and the people will not hear you. They will not see you. What kind of test? What kind of challenge is that? That's what I mean in there. That's what grandfather meant. That's what the child meant when he said the ancient scouts. Scouts whose enemies were still strong, still lethal, still highly aware. Let's say you're learning play tennis or some other sport, and you pick a partner that's slightly better than you, eventually you know you're going to beat the partner. And if you stick with it, it'll no longer be a challenge. If you stay with that partner, you're never going to get any better. You got to find somebody to play with that's higher level. It's like in tracking. If you go out and practice tracking on tracks that you can see easily, your skill remains absolutely the same. It stagnates. That's why when you practice, you look for that wall, that track that you cannot find. And then spend 2, 3, 5, 10 hours to find it. And then once you find it, you will never have difficulty with tracks of that level of difficulty again. So that's what I mean by the ancient scouts. Scouts that were not softened by tracking the soft, pathetic targets of the early pioneers. There was a long silence until grandfather spoke to the child's spirit, asking, "And what will happen to the worlds of man?" There was another period of silence until finally the child spoke again. Those 2 periods of silence hold great meaning, hold great revelation for grandfather, ultimately for me. Those 2 periods of silence I will come back to at a later date, not in this 4th recording, because they are very applicable to the 3 subordinate prophecies that are found between the 1st and 2nd, those 4 days of silence. You got to be careful of that term, silence, because it means a lot more than what we know silence as being. The child spoke, saying, "There will be a great famine throughout the world, like man cannot imagine." Notice the child did not say, "There'll be a great famine throughout the land." Because that leads one to believe, well, if you get a couple of pieces of land over, there won't be a famine. You know? I mean, look at, people believe that where they live is the center of the universe. It's like the Egyptians. When they went through certain plagues and masses of people were starving. Man, the world was starving. No, Egypt was starving. Go up north a few hundred miles or south a few hundred miles and people are going, what? Get out to California or go down there around Georgia last summer. They talk about drought, talk about dwindling water supplies. Go to the Northeast, what drought? What water supplies? We've got plenty. That's the danger in that spirit saying land. Now, famine throughout the world, like man cannot imagine. Waters will run vile. The poisons of man's sin running strong in the waters of soil, lakes, and rivers. You know, one of the reasons they preserve the pine barrens over here, the pine lands, because that is one huge behemoth aquifer. There is enough water in the Pine Barrens there to take care of New York, all of New Jersey, and Baltimore. But guess what? They're finding they can't pump it. Why? Here you have this beautiful aquifer. Here you have an old toxic chemical dump. And you start draining that aquifer, and where is that chemical going to go? Down into the aquifer. It's already happened. It's already happened in areas of Tom's River where Seba Geigy had so polluted the damn Tom's River and the aquifer that still to this day people are dying of the most horrific cancers imaginable. This is what the child is talking about. The famine, the drought is going to be such that aquifers are going to be drained and the waters will run vile. The poisons of man's sin running strong in the waters, the soils, the lakes, and the rivers. Crops will fail, and animals of man will die, and disease will kill the masses. Animals of man will die. That is an earth-shaking statement. Animals of man will die. Crops will fail. The animal and diseases will kill the masses. Bless my brother. He is weird. No, he isn't. The esteemed Dr. Brown. You don't want to have dinner with the man because you'll be sitting at a table someplace in a restaurant and he will name probably 3,900 diseases you can get from that fleck of food that was not removed from your plate during dishwashing, But he made a statement, and it was funny because I have always been a zealous collector of indigenous plant seeds, especially crops. I've got so many varieties of primitive corn, like flint corn, 7 varieties of Hopi corn. I have different primitive squash beans, the sisters plants, corn, squash, and beans that the Mohawks and Seneca used to plant. Why? Because I know that those plants, though they don't produce these massive crops as do our modern hybrids, they are highly resistant to disease, where our hybrids are not. I remember at the original farm, I had this row of corn. It happened to be flint corn. And it was an Algonquin variety, very rare. And I was growing it up to get not to eat, but to preserve the kernels. And there was a farm inspector that had come through my standard class, and he said, "Tom, what is this corn?" And I told him, and he said, that is absolutely illegal, my friend. You know that, don't you? And I said, why? He says, there's laws on the books right now that you cannot cultivate X, Y, and Z sort of plants because they're afraid they're going to mix with the hybridized plants. So, my brother said that, how many viruses are out there? Not insect infestations of biblical proportion, but viruses and bacteria that are so fast mutating. All they need is one or two, compounded by global warming. And that was a topic of discussion between Brother Jim and I back as early as 1962, but the early days of the tracker school. He said it'd take one or two, even one virus, bacteria, to wipe out every grain crop in the United States and the world, much like any other disease will go worldwide. Everything from rice to wheat to corn, barley, you name it. Think about that domino effect. How long before we could no longer feed our livestock? How long before we could no longer feed ourselves? They're the questions. When this child's spirit that spoke from the heavens said the crops will fail, the animals of man will die, and disease will kill the masses, when that child was talking about crops, what do you think about? Rows of corn, fields of wheat. When you think of animals of man, what do you think about? Goats, sheep, cattle. And disease will kill the masses. He's not really talking about man there. He's talking about disease killing the crops of man, the animals of man. Isn't it nice to know that wild, edible, medicinal plants will still flourish? Isn't it nice to know that the animals not of man will flourish? The grandchildren will feed upon the remains of the dead, and all about will be the cries of pain and anguish. Talking about riding the edge of destitution, pain, and suffering. We all heard the stories of Donner Pass, California, where that wagon train that got marooned, they fed upon the dead. Happened recently again in that plane crash in the Andes. We kind of like to forget that, ignore it. But humankind, pressed to the edge of starvation, will feed upon other humans. Grandchildren will feed upon the remains of the dead, and all about will be the cries of pain and anguish. Pain and anguish coming from the very disease and the starvation. Roving bands of men will hunt and kill other men for food, and water will always be scarce and getting scarcer with each passing year. That's worrisome. Understatement. That's why the children of the earth have to hide, have to live like the ancient scouts. In that 10-year period of time, yeah, there's going to be the armchair hunters who eventually, after running throughout the cities and killing and eating everything there and then moving into the suburbs and then into the farmlands, will eventually try to penetrate wilderness. But the animals will elude them. The fish will elude them. Nature will turn its back on them. The Spirit that moves through all things, the Spirit will destroy them. But in their quest to feed themselves, they're going to eat anything that they can kill, anything that moves. That's why I've always said that having a bunker someplace in Oregon full of food and ammunition and everything else, how much food are you going to store? 10 years of food for you and your family, and you think this is not going to be a target for somebody who's hungry? Of course it is. You'll be under siege until you die and are eaten. The land, the water, the sky will all be poisoned, and man will live in the wrath of the Creator. Man will hide at first in the cities, but there he will die. This is an important point backing up. Will live in the wrath of the Creator. I always believe we do not live in the biblical context of a wrathful, judgmental God, but a kind and loving Creator that I choose to call Grandfather. I don't think so much it is the wrath of the Creator as much as it is the wrath of the Spirit that moves through all things. Yes, I believe that the Creator can get angry. Angry that He gave His children such a beautiful, perfect gift of the earth. And we took that gift and we destroyed it. And in so doing, we spat in the face of the Creator. Man will hide at first in the cities, but there he will die. He's going to run out of food. They're going to kill each other. A few will run to the wilderness, but the wilderness will destroy them. That is the spirit that has nothing to lose, refuses to get reinfected. But the wilderness will destroy them, for they had long ago been given a choice. Man will be destroyed, his cities in ruin, and it is then that the grandchildren will pay for the sins of their grandfathers and grandmothers. All right. You know, one of the things, when we eventually get into what we'll call the supporting philosophy or prophecies, and the also the lead in and the exit of my personal movement into that night of the four prophecies, I will get back to this concept where the Spirit of the child says, and it is then that the grandchildren will pay for the sins of their grandfathers and grandmothers. And when I heard that, I thought to myself, okay, we've gone through crop failure. We've gone through the death of the animals of man. We have gone through roving bands of people hunting other people for food, and grandchildren feeding on the remains of the dead. And now the grandchildren are going to pay for the sins of our grandfathers and grandmothers. Now, wasn't that all enough as by way of payment? You know, could it get worse? Yes, it can. It can. And I can't fully explain that to you yet. But there is this event that is going to happen that all I can say is that death will not provide any escape. Whether you die during this purification or 150 years before it, you will pay for your sins. That means it will get to you in the world of spirit. Because as you know, what is happening in the flesh and the force is just a reflection of that which is happening in spirit, and vice versa. In that statement, it is then that the grandchildren will pay for the sins of their grandfathers and grandmothers. You know, it took me a while, as you'll see, to arrive at the conclusion that I did, and was later confirmed by grandfather. But it was like that vengeful part of self thought back to all those people in my life that so willfully destroyed the gardens of Eden for greed, convenience, and profit, and how now they are hiding peacefully in their death, but they will be held accountable and punished. There's a certain sadistic satisfaction in that knowledge. Forgive me, but I say that with peace, love, and joy in my heart. Is there then no hope? Grandfather asked. The child spoke again. There is only hope during the first and the second signs. You notice that it goes back and forth between prophecy and sign, because that's what these prophecies are. They are a sign. If those skies turn red, that's the sign that says get out of Dodge. You know, you got holes in the sky, it's a sign that the earth can no longer heal itself physically. Upon the third sign, the night of the bleeding, there's no longer hope, for only the children of the earth will survive. Man will be given these warnings. If unheeded, there can be no hope. For only the children of the earth will purge themselves of the cancers of mankind, of mankind's destructive thinking. It will be the children of the earth who will bring a new hope to a new society, living closer to the earth and spirit. That's why the child's voice delivered that fourth prophecy. When it comes to it, it is the beginning. After all, in the beginning of all of this, grandfather sat at the lip of that cave, facing the direction and waiting for the rising sun. The metaphor of the rising sun, the power of the rising sun, which drives away the ignorance of darkness. That means that he sat at the threshold of that wisdom. But from that point, he was still in the purification of winter. He was still in the darkness of that purification. And as I said, what we're working for now is going to be the inevitable. We are on the threshold of a decision. We either make a decision to realize that, oh my God, look what we've done, and we've got to change things. And it will be a slow but very effective change back to a balance in the earth. A new dawn, a new thinking. Or it's the one that I'm speaking about now. The deadly, disastrous, painful, suffering-ridden change. Its choice is ours. Yet when I read reports that 60-70% of the modern world does not care about global warming, we don't stand much of a chance. Then all was silent. Silence again. The landscape cleared and returned to normal, and Grandfather stepped from the vision. Shaken, he said that he had wandered for the next season, trying to understand all that had been given to him, trying to understand why he had been chosen. Now here in this last paragraph that I'm going to read, it is not true of that night. It is true of the rest of the time Grandfather and I were together, because I said that first night he gave the prophecies, and for the next several years he expanded on them. Grandfather had related the story to me in great detail during that night of the 4 prophecies. I don't think that any event had been left out, and his emotions and thoughts were such that he actually relived it for us. Thus, the power of his vision became part of our spirit, our driving force, and a big part of our fears. I sat for a long time up on the hill. The fire had gone out, and all had retired to sleep for the night. Creation seemed to be at a standstill, awaiting the darkest part of the night to pass by. I felt alone and vulnerable, as if all of creation were scrutinizing my every thought. I had no idea what to do with what Grandfather had given me through his vision. How could I ever make a difference or make anyone understand the vision of another? Well, I just did. With the ending of that sentence, I led someone to another's vision, and they understood. That's the important thing to me. That it is passed down and spread like a wildfire. We are so close to those red skies that we might not yet be able to see them. But to anybody spiritually attuned, we can feel them. We can feel their closeness.